Catch-22 is a satirical historical fiction written by American author Joseph Heller. It was published in 1961 and is set during the second half of the Second World War. Joseph Heller was born in 1923 in New York and died in 1999 at the age of 76. The novel Catch-22 follows a soldier named John Yossarian. Many men in his squadron think that Yossarian is insane because he believes that people are trying to kill him. Yossarian, on the other hand, thinks that everybody else is crazy for not seeing a problem with the war. Yossarian thinks that it's morally wrong to kill people, and he's also terrified of dying. Because of this, Yossarian is seen as an outsider by the other men. He lives by the motto, "Stay alive or die trying." He tries to avoid flying dangerous missions and comes up with elaborate plans to get out of them. The night before an extremely dangerous mission, Yossarian snuck into the colonel's office and moved the pins to make it look like they had already flown and successfully completed the mission. He also spent a lot of time in the hospital, pretending to have various diseases. He tries to be discharged from the military, claiming that he's crazy, but nobody believes that he's actually insane. Everybody agrees that any sane person would call themselves crazy to try to escape the war. While he's in the hospital, Yossarian meets a couple of interesting people. One of those people receives the title of the Soldier in White. The Soldier in White is a soldier who is completely wrapped in white bandages from head to toe. Nobody knows who this soldier is, but Yossarian often talks to him anyways. When the soldier dies, Yossarian has to pretend to be him so that the family can say their final goodbyes. He gets bandaged up and just has to lay in the bed while the family says their tearful goodbyes. A couple of months later, another completely bandaged soldier shows up at the hospital and takes the place of the old soldier in white. Somebody who regularly visits Yossarian in the hospital is the chaplain. The chaplain loses a lot of his faith in God after witnessing the horrors of the war, and he struggles to believe through all of the senseless violence around him. The chaplain's atheistic assistant, Corporal Whitcomb, wants to send form letters home to families of soldiers that have died or been injured during battle. The chaplain disagrees, and he says that the letters are insincere. Colonel Cathcart insists on sending the letters because he believes that they will bring him more recognition. Things like this make the chaplain realize that religion isn't valued on its own terms. Later in the novel, the chaplain is dragged to an isolated cellar and accused of many crimes that he didn't commit. After this, the chaplain realizes that his innocence is irrelevant if people have more power than him. The title of this novel comes from a law that is mentioned multiple times throughout the book. A catch-22 is defined on Google as a dilemma or difficult circumstance from which there is no escape because of mutually conflicting or dependent conditions. In the novel, the soldiers are unable to escape the war because of insanity. They're required to stay in the military until all of their missions have been completed. Catch-22 is also defined as a law that is illegal to read. A Catch-22 is useful to those that created it, but not for those who have to follow it. A big theme in Catch-22 is the inevitability of dying. Yossarian has one goal, and that is to stay alive during the war. He's always thinking about death and coming up with plans to avoid it. Even though he often thinks about his death, the fear of dying reminds Yossarian how precious life actually is. He always tries to see the good things in the world, and he is passionate about living and loving. Yossarian wastes no time falling in love or making friends because he knows that his time on Earth could be cut short. He often travels to Rome and tries to find women that he can fall in love with. This doesn't usually work for him, but it shows that he doesn't put things off until it's too late. The events that take place in Catch-22 don't happen in chronological order, which makes the book a little tricky to follow. An event that happens in one of the first few chapters could be revisited at the end of the book, so you would have to remember what the narrator was even talking about. Because this is a war novel, it can be hard to keep track of the soldiers that are still alive and the soldiers that have been killed. When the events are switching back and forth, it becomes even harder to keep track. This book is pretty good, but it's not something that I would want to read a second time. The order of events definitely adds something to the novel, but makes the storyline difficult to follow sometimes. I think Catch-22 is different from other war stories because it shows a side of a soldier that is sometimes overlooked. Yossarian is terrified of being killed, but most people assume that all soldiers are brave and unafraid. He spends the majority of his time in a hospital just to avoid being on the battlefield, which says a lot about how soldiers truly feel. A big motif in this novel is the number of missions a soldier must complete before he is eligible to be discharged from the war. Colonel Cathcart wants to be promoted to general, and he thinks he can get there if he continues to increase the number of required missions. The missions are one of the only ways to keep track of the chronology in the book. It's also the biggest example of a Catch-22 that's found in this book. Every time that Yossarian comes close to completing his missions, the Colonel raises them again. The raising of required missions is what ultimately prompts Yossarian to seek an alternative escape method. After reading this book, I have a better understanding of how a soldier might feel trapped in the war. Catch-22 describes it as a sort of never-ending cycle. There's always more battles to fight and more missions to complete. Overall, I thought this was a good book, but I probably wouldn't recommend it unless you're very interested in the war and the military. Joseph Heller does a good job of bringing light to a pretty serious situation, and he always tries to keep the mood happy. Heller tries to take a comedic approach to a situation that's not very funny at all, and I think he did a pretty good job. This wasn't the easiest book to finish, and it was often boring to me, but by the end of the book, it was truly a good novel and a good story.